Okay. Hi, my name is Lynette, and this is All Things Development. Today, we are going to be looking at land reforms in Zimbabwe, and we're just going to go a bit, into the history of Zimbabwe to see why land was so unequally distributed in this country. So, Zimbabwe was a British colony in the late 19th century up to 1965, and in 1930. A land bill was passed called the Land Apportionment Bill that said that the white settlers would get arable land in most of the fertile places. I mean, of course, it was fertile, but they'd get arable land, and the black Zimbabweans would be pushed into reserves that the land was not fertile and where, they would probably be congested. So it was basically the white settlers wanted to farm and they were doing commercial farming, and they pushed Zimbabweans out of their land and into these reserves. But this was made possible by that bill of 1930. So it was similar to South Africa, but not apartheid. It's just that it was by law that you could not, as a black Zimbabwean, you could not own land in certain areas of Zimbabwe because it was owned by the white settlers. So most of the white settlers were farming, and because the conditions of those reserves were not conducive for farming, most to get an income, most of the black Zimbabweans would come to the farms and work there, either as casual or permanent laborers. And by the early 1960s, there was a movement in most African countries wanted independence. And Britain had already started saying, okay, yeah, it's time we exited. Let's give these people their independence. But it's not like it was just given on a silver platter. Here is your independence. And most African countries had to fight. They had to fight for this independence. So in 1965, that's when Britain decided that it will exit Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe will no longer be a colony of theirs. However, instead of Zimbabwe going back to Zimbabweans, the white settlers who are still there said, wait a minute, we do not want to leave. This is our home. This is where we have invested. This is where our farms are. Why don't we just form a government, an independent sovereign country that is not part of the UK? Of course, Britain was not amused, but what could they do? So in 1965, the white minority settlers formed New Zimbabwe, that they were the people who were running the country. Their prime minister was Ian Smith, and therefore, then the Zimbabweans did not get independence. This caused again another liberation war, whereby actually in the late 70s, Robert Mugabe and other Zimbabwean nationalists were really fighting for independence. This was the Second Chimurenga War. So, after 7 years of intense fighting, the white minorities decided to concede, and this was done at Lancaster House. It was called the Lancaster House Agreement, and they signed, the handover of how they will do the transition. So some of the conditions to transition peacefully was that Robert Mugabe and the other nationalists would agree that the white settlers would not be forced out of their land. If anything, if they wanted the land, the government would have to have a market-led land reform, whereby it was a willing seller, willing buyer, same thing as South Africa, same thing as Kenya. That was what was agreed. And if that was the case, then the land would have to be at market value. And when the government would buy the land, they'd have to pay they would have to pay the white settlers immediately. This was agreed because, at that time, the nationalists didn't have that much leverage. Also, the white settlers would have representation in parliament. I believe, like, in the Senate they had like a quarter representation, of the white minority, and in the House of Assemblies it was also there was some representation, some significant representation. That meant that their interests were protected. Also, another interesting thing, for the next 10 years, there would be only market led land reforms of willing buyer, willing seller. So the government was not able to, take land. And, actually, the West settlers were really, very tense about Robert Mugabe, because they knew he'd be probably the next president, and they were scared that he would, force them out. So I think that's why they made those clauses. So in 1980, there were elections between ZANU and ZAPU, and ZANU won, and they formed like a coalition of ZANU PF. Robert Mugabe became the first African president of Zimbabwe. And as I said, the white settlers were a bit antsy. They were like, what's going to happen? But he was preaching reconciliation, way forward, and this calmed them down. Also, the agreements, the Lancaster agreements, made them, okay. So that was the 80s. The 80s were not bad. The manufacturing companies were still there. Commercial farming was still going on. White settlers were still taken care of. But I just wanted to point out, politically, there was there were mass murders actually of Dembele. It was a fight of, it was a political kind of fight. So there was that tension, there was that tension that happened at that time, that war. It wasn't even tension, it was actually like mass murders of, a certain community, then the Mbeles, they were killed during this time. So but mostly the 80s were okay. The British had already promised them to give them a grant for the land reforms, for the market led land reforms, and they had already given them 44 million pounds. So there were, the government was accelerating the market led reforms, so they had the module of, willing buyer, willing seller. However, the thing is, sometimes some of the land they were buying was not the best. They were being sold for not the best, at maybe not the best prices, but at least it was working, and the government was able to resettle quite a number of black Zimbabweans. So what happens after 1980? Already Zimbabwe had begun borrowing, just to, I mean, all countries will borrow to, to be able to run. But the 1990s actually was called the lost decade in Zimbabwe. And why? Because Zimbabwe was borrowing from IMF, World Bank, and during this time, the the loans that they were giving were on condition. The condition was something called the Economic Structural Adjustment Program. And these programs are economic reform strategies to make sure that the most African countries, because many African countries were put under SAPs, that's what they're called. They were put under the SAPs, and so that they could recoup, the World Bank and IMF could ensure that the money that they had loaned out to these African countries was paid back. So Zimbabwe took money with the SAPs, but the conditions were, we're gonna open up the markets, we're gonna liberalize the markets, and that's what's happened. So before, it was the economy was mostly state run, but now it was gonna move to a different model. As we all know, as most of us know, that SAPs were a fail in most African countries, and because there was a lot of privatization of state-run industries, so there were mass retrenchments. People lost jobs because of the privatization. People lost jobs. There was also deregulating policies whereby maybe they'll deregulate like banking, agriculture. There were those things. So the states had less control. um, Food subsidies dropped drastically, so prices went up. During the 90s, there were quite a number of strikes. In fact, there was a national strike, as in women were complaining they can't buy food. There's massive unemployment because people have lost jobs. Um, there was devaluation of the currency, and market-led reforms are not, SAPs are not all bad. Market liberalization is not all bad because it helps competition to come into the market. It allows healthy competition. Sometimes that can also lead to price drops, but the measures were really hard on the government. And by the 90s, the money that Zimbabwe was earning in form of exports, 37% of their money was going to pay that loan. So that meant there was also less money for healthcare, less money for education. So we find that less people were going to school. Healthcare was not free. It was not affordable. It was a tough decade for most Zimbabweans. And during this time, also, there was the war veterans, the ones who fought for independence. They were supposed to be compensated in land and monetary compensation, but this had not happened. There were around 60,000 war veterans. So in independence, like 20,000 of them were absorbed, then 40,000 were, left. And in 1993, there was a war compensation fund that was supposed to compensate the war veterans, but this money kind of did not reach them because there was a lot of bureaucracy, there was a lot of corruption at that time. And by 1997, the war veterans had come together and said, we want our money. They were exerting a lot of pressure on Robert Mugabe's party and government, and and Robert Mugabe said, okay, we are gonna actually give you a one-off payment, and also some pension every month. The only problem with this is that there was no budget for that. It was not even sustainable. This were about 70,000 people, like there was no money for that. Unfortunately, that was the case. It wasn't planned. Actually, let me not say there was no money. It was just not planned for. So the budget, was tampered with at that time. Then also something else happened during, I believe it was the 90s, but I'll confirm it, that Congo had asked the southern countries to, help him fight attacks by, like people who, there was a war in Congo, and Rwanda and Uganda had come together and they were fighting. Laurent Kabila and Kabila asked for, help from Angola, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe sent around 11,000 troops to but I'll have to confirm the time. I don't know if it was the last decade or I'll just confirm the time for you, but there was that also that caused, a strain to the Zimbabweans. So anyway, they sent out 11,000 military troops there, and it was estimated that in a month in a year they were spending like $200 million to fight in that war, and Zimbabwe for sure did not have that money. So anyway, there was a lot of angst by the people. They were like, where are we fighting wars that are not supposed to be there? We are not supposed to be fighting other people's war. Here you have embraced the ACPs. They are causing havoc on the economy. The food prices are high, and then also another thing had happened. By 1997, Britain had changed parties from the conservatives to the Labour Party. And Tony Blair, his government had said that, it is not our obligation to actually just give you the money for your land reforms. It's not a must, it's not an obligation. It's not a must. So the money had went down, and there was little money that Mugabe could use for the land reforms to actually pay for land. So 10 years had elapsed, and now by that time there was already pressure from the people that this is not working. We still do not have land. Also, at that time, um, the first opposition party had already been formed, that is MDC, Movement for Democratic Change, and the leader was Morgan uh, Changirai. So because of that pressure, because people actually, the pressure was so bad because people were already tired of these governments, the economic reforms had not worked. And actually, even the white settlers, the white farmers were supporting MDC. And they were like, yeah, we need a new government. This government of Mugabe is not working. This ZANU PF is not working. So it was, MDC was gaining a lot of traction at that time. And this pushed Mugabe to actually start pushing for, you know what? The 10-year clause of the Lancaster House Agreement is about to elapse, and now we're gonna take the land by force. So this is what happened. Under the Land Acquisition Act, they were able to change, because he couldn't really change the constitution just like that, but he could amend it. So it was amended to a way that they could acquire land by force. And already, that the war veterans had already been given massive payouts, so they had their allegiances to ZANU PF. Most of the war veterans were the ones who were evicting the white settlers from their land. This happened now, it's ushered now to the next decade of 2000 to up to, to 2008 thereabouts. Those are that was now the third decade, but I think this was even worse than the last decade, because immediately white settlers were evicted from the land. By the way, there were some killings. Also, some of the white settlers unfortunately lost their lives in this transition. It's not that they shouldn't have taken the land. It's the way it was done. It's the way that it was done. It's never a good way to forcefully take land. And some of the white settlers had actually paid, the government for that land in 1980 when ZANU got, entered, government. They had actually paid for the land. So it's not that they were just staying in land that did not belong to them. They had paid it maybe from the other white settlers, and they were forcefully evicted. Many of them went to other countries, neighboring countries like Mozambique and the rest, and they were able to be successful there. However, this was really, really unacceptable for the international community. So immediately, sanctions were put in place. Immediately that happened, the value of Zimbabwe currency went down drastically by like 50%. Sanctions were put in place, and manufacturing industry went down. Of course, agriculture, which was a staple industry economy, earner for the country, was completely ruined, because now the farmers, especially the war veterans, were actually settled in that land, and they were just there because, one, they don't have the technical know-how how to run those farms. In some of those farms, even the farms which had animals, some of them were just eating the animals and not working that land, because it was forcefully, the way it was done was just wrong. So international community says, we are not giving you any more aid. We are sanctioning you. No more trade with us. We are not trading with you. You cannot come to our countries. You are on your own. Everything went downhill from there. It was so bad. It was so bad. And And you'd think that MDC would have won elections that time, but they didn't. They didn't win the elections. There were also quite a number of human rights issues. So the white settlers went, and now that ushered into the fast track program of land reforms. The problem with the fast track was that there was not much planning. There was a lot of loopholes with the legal systems and stuff like that. And because of the consequences of being sanctioned and everything, the economy just tanked. It went down. The good thing was that the land reforms, I mean, people now, the black communities were getting land, and the only problem it was that they could only do small scale farming, because even the land, it was leased out to them. They did not have titles of the land, so even if they wanted to go commercial, they couldn't get loans from the bank, they couldn't get capital, because what would they give as collateral? There was nothing, because the land was in leases, like 99-year leases, but it's still not theirs. So there were those problems. Once the international community left, no money coming through, the GDP earner agriculture was down on its knees, and it was a really hard time for Zimbabwe. In fact, like 80% of Zimbabweans were were unemployed. That's how high unemployment was in Zimbabwe. Um, uh, Cash crops like wheat and coffee that were top earners, it just went down. So in 2007, 2008, there were elections, and it was supposed to be, Morgan who won of MDC, because people were already fed up with this government. Everything has gone down the drain. But because Mugabe did not concede, they had to do a coalition party. In fact, actually, Morgan is the one who conceded. He's like, you know what? There were a lot of killings at that time. His people were getting killed, so he decided, you know what? It's not worth that. We are gonna just agree that Mugabe comes in, but to make everything fair, because of international pressure, there was a coalition government, and it was good to some level, but the problem was Mugabe Zanu had still so much leverage, so much say in the government. So it's kind of did not work, and the sanctions were still in place, everything was still in place. The fast track land reform had already happened. So, and Mugabe, he did not look as if he wanted to leave, because in 2017 he was actually ousted. He said, I mean, it was a resignation from his part, but it was like a military coup. I remember I was in Zimbabwe at that time, and I didn't understand the gravity of the matter, because at some point, before Mugabe was ousted, there was a lot of military on the streets and things like that. But yeah, around that time there was quite some tension, but he had to go. He was already quite old, in his 90s. It was time to leave. So the vice president came and became Emerson Mnangagwa, became the president. And he said, now what we're going to do, we're going to actually compensate the people who lost land during the fast track reforms. And he actually pledged, like, to pay out, to compensate especially the white settlers who lost their land, or who were forcefully removed from their land, $3.5 million. The only problem is, where was this money? Because already the country's economy had tanked. By that time, the Zimbabwean dollar had been replaced by the US dollar, because there was hyperinflation. Zimbabwean dollar was worth nothing. It was, you'd go to the shop and buy an ice cream for a billion. Like, it was crazy like that. So he came up and said that this is the way forward. And so far, some of the compensation has been done, but however, to get the money, he needs investor confidence, which is not there. And also, President Emerson has had some human rights issues. People are saying that, that even after he became president in 2018, he's made like 27 changes in the judiciary just to consolidate his power so that he cannot leave. So again, that's an issue, especially for the international community, because they want free and fair elections. In 2018, there was no international community to come and monitor the elections. So when something like that happens, you wonder what, the international community has no confidence, and that means that investors might not come, and they may also not give them aid. Although now there's China, so at least they can get aid from China. Also, so as per now, they have been, to say the most, I can't say land reforms in Zimbabwe have been a complete failure. It's just that the way it moved, there were so many problems they had, like the promise that Britain made that they would, and all the other international donors made, the pledges they made, they did not keep them. The international community had pledged about 160 million dollars for the land reforms. Only about 44, 50 million, dollars, pounds was given, so there was no money, and that was causing a lot of pressure for Robert Mugabe to, to give back his people their land, and that's where he went. Plus the opposition, that's why he went that route of fast track. But also his government was also not, without fault, because there was a lot of corruption, and some of the politicians were being given land. You see what happened with the war veterans. They were first not compensated, and then that pushed to making a alternate budget that was not even there. The sanctions did not help Zimbabwe, but there has been progress. It's just that now the president has the responsibility to restore donor confidence, investor confidence, and so that he can jumpstart the economy, so it's not an easy solution. I don't think there's any easy solution, because already, apart from the land issues, there's these other issues of sanctions and no money in the economy. But Zimbabwe, I think, has so much promise. It was actually the breadbasket of Africa. It is so fertile. The land is so fertile. There's so much that can be done. Already they have discovered, I think, there are diamonds in Zimbabwe. So there's so much natural wealth resource. It's just that they need to put the right leaders in place. The right leaders, because the right leader will always determine which economic modules, how they will go about this, what kind of diplomacy they'll have with the international communities, how fast they'll do the land reform, if there'll be corruption because if there's corruption, then there's nothing that's going to happen. The money will be given, but then it will go into other people's pockets. So I believe Zimbabwe still has a lot of hope. Hopefully, now that the elections will be next year, 2023, let's see what happens. Let's see if there'll be a change of government, maybe. Let's see what they'll do about the land reforms. Some of the white settlers have started coming back in. Let's see if that will help the situation. But they also need to actually also provide technical assistance to the Zimbabweans. You just can't give people land and there's nothing there. You've not given them credit. It's in the middle of nowhere. There are no amenities, there's no infrastructure, there are no roads. They really need to look into that. So that's land reforms in Zimbabwe. And yeah, if you have any questions, if you have any comments or corrections, you know what to do. Just write in the comment section. And if you've enjoyed or you've learned something, you can subscribe to my channel. I'll see you next time. on our next African topic. Bye.